The first transcontinental railroad, with a total length of more than 2,000 miles, traverses the entire North America continent in the mid-19th century, with today's Texas, California, and Utah becoming U.S. territory, the vast and fertile land in the West waiting for cultivation. Gold and silver mines awaits exploration. In 1862, President Lincoln greenlights the construction of a railroad to connect East and West, which would be conducted by two railroad companies, the Union Pacific from East and the Central Pacific from the West. The western section of the railroad has to pass through the entire Sierra Nevada, which contains steep terrain, making the project extremely difficult. On May 10, 1869, the construction of the railroad was completed. When the world's concentration are on the completion and praising for the tremendous achievement, no one noticed the great contribution of Chinese workers. In fact, without the contribution and the wisdom of the Chinese workers, the construction of the railroad wouldn't be possible to finish within just 7 years. On the nearly 600 miles Central Pacific section, 95% of the work was completed in the 4 years when Chinese workers joined the construction. This May, with joint efforts from volunteers and the representatives of the Chinese workers' descendants, the Utah Division of State History conducted the excavation work on all sides of the current abandoned railroad, digging out evidence of Chinese workers living during those times.
So this material that I have is some of the more impressive items that were recovered from the excavation a few weeks ago. And so the artifacts that were recovered during the 1 week, really speaks to that trans-Pacific connection of the workers, that they were very much connected to trade networks from home while here in the middle of nowhere, Utah.
Because the inadequate preservation of that history and revealing true story of the construction, there are not quite enough documents or memorable collections about that railroad construction, especially record of Chinese workers' contribution. Nowadays, we can only cherish that memory from Golden Spike Historical Park, where the two sections of the railroads joined together in 1989. But from the documentary in the auditorium, there is almost no any image about Chinese workers. The items Chris and volunteers have recently excavated can only be labeled first and placed in their own office, with more accurate and scientific archaeological demonstrations continue in the future.
And a lot of folks are going after stuff like these.
Well, this is typically a Chinese coin.
Yep.
Chinese type, yeah.
Bingo. And so this is pretty interesting. You see it has a very...
Can I touch it?
Yes, you may. It has the square hole, which is very indicative of a Chinese coin in this period. But also Vietnamese coins and Japanese coins have that similar hole. And so you see how badly corroded it is.
Yeah.
But you can actually, there is some character still on there. And so we'll clean this up and try to identify if it was Chinese coin.
In addition, Chris' team also unearthed certain typical Chinese objects such as Chinese weiqi and ink stone for calligraphy. Furthermore, Chris introduced to us what Chinese workers' life would be at that time from an old picture, which was a maintenance town of the railroad, also mainly constructed by Chinese workers. But in this precious picture, there was no any Chinese-related elements.
This photo is showing the large two-story train depot.
Train depot.
So this is
Small
where...
shops, our restaurants.
Yeah, so that's Main Street in downtown Terrace with restaurants, saloons, the railroad tracks. You can even see a steam train on the edge.
Yeah.
But this is crazy because this is full desert. And so Terrace had to pipe water 13 miles to get fresh water to town. And so the Chinese helped to construct the water line from the mountains in the back of this photo all the way in so the railroad could have water for the trains and people second. And so you see also they're planting all these trees. They wanted this town to be a thing.
Chris mentioned that in middle of 19th century, with immigration waves, there were many towns in the West have Chinese characters, whether it's laundries or restaurants. It couldn't be possible that the picture is not showing any of Chinese elements unless it had been avoided intentionally. From another archaeological point of view, it is sufficient proof that Chinese workers were very much spatially segregated.
Doing the on-the-ground archaeology, we actually found probably where there was a business. And it was probably just off Main Street. And so it's not captured in the photo, but again, this stuff shows us where there was probably a business on Main Street that doesn't show up in the historical record. The other issue is that, so you had Main Street, train depot, railroad tracks, and then all the maintenance shops, all the coal bins. Then you had Chinatown.
Oh, okay.
It was on the very outskirts of town, on the backside of the coal bins, very much spatially segregated from every other part of the community.
According to historical records, the average income of Chinese workers participated in the railway construction was much lower than that of the white workers, even without accommodation and insurance. Due to harsh geological conditions and severe weather in the winter times, with frequent snowstorms and avalanches, thousands of Chinese workers lost their lives during the construction. Later, there was a widely quoted saying that there could be a skeleton of a Chinese worker under each tie of the railway.